Welcome to Better Than We Found It, the podcast for leaders driven to leave a positive mark through their leadership.
I hope that I will have created some ways in which the circumstances of your birth don't predict the opportunities you have in your life.
I'm Josh Huggins, your host and the founder of GS2 Partnership, a search firm committed to connecting visionaries dedicated to environmental and social betterment.
I have two young sons. I want to be able to tell them I did use the resources and expertise of a company to try to create more awareness about climate change.
In each episode, we delve into the minds of executive and future leaders. We discuss how sustainability guides responsible leadership, sparks change, and drives value.
The way of thinking I try and advocate is for us all to think about us having a collective problem to fix, which is climate, and that we need to rebuild our global economy.
We are GS2, and we are on a critical journey to connect to those who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. Hello and welcome back to Better Than We Found It. We're here, it's season 2. I'm delighted with how season 1 went in launching the podcast, but now season 2 is here and our plan is to make it even better. And what better way to start than with our first guest? Our guest is Tony Goldner, the Executive Director for the TNFD, the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Now, if the TNFD is an organisation you're not familiar with, but you're considering nature-related risks within your organisation, then this one's for you. If you're passionate about sustainability and being a purpose-led leader, well, then this one's for you as well. And if you're interested in hearing how somebody's career path can shape them into the executive leader that they become, then again, this one is for you. We have a fascinating discussion. Tony is a brilliant guy, very purpose-driven, and has a wealth of international and global relations experience that mean he is the right person to lead this extremely important initiative. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Please give us your feedback. We're delighted to hear from any of our listeners in terms of how they feel the conversations go, any guests that they'd be interested in. But for the launch of season 2, here is Tony Goldner. So let's dive right in. So Tony, welcome to Better Than We Found It.
Hi Josh, great to be with you. Thanks very much.
Excellent. So I have done a mini introduction to you before we started, but I'm sure you'll do a much better job than I did. So would you mind, just for the audience and those listening who don't know who you are, a bit about who you are and also the TNFD, and I suppose why at a high level it exists?
Yeah, so I'm the Executive Director of the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. It's a bit of a mouthful, TNFD for short. And we are an international initiative to try and bring nature into the consideration and the risk management processes, and ultimately into the corporate reporting of business and financial institutions. Some people in the audience may have heard of TCFD, which is our sort of big sister and mentor initiative, which was launched by Michael Bloomberg in 2016. And they wanted to do the same thing, which is get companies to start reporting on their climate impacts. But of course, they only covered the greenhouse gas emissions and took on the issue of climate change. And so that left the rest of nature essentially unattended to. And so TNFD was born to cover the rest of those aspects of nature. And bring that into standard corporate reporting practice. So that's our mission. That's why we exist, and that's what we're doing. Excellent.
And you've been with the initiative since 21, right? Was that right at the start, or what? Tell us about the.
Yeah, TNFD was launched after a 12-month sort of preparatory phase. It was launched in the middle of 2021. With the appointment of our two co-chairs, one of whom is David Craig, the former founder and CEO of Refinitiv, which was then bought by the London Stock Exchange Group. And our other co-chair is an amazing woman called Elizabeth Marema, who's the Deputy Secretary, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Environment Programme. So they were appointed in June 2021, and I joined them a couple of months later with a business plan and a whole bunch of very enthusiastic supporters and people trying to get this thing off the ground, and I joined to kind of pull it all together and build a team to execute on our mission.
Wonderful. Well, I remember there's a story in how you came to be in that role in itself that I'm sure we're going to cover off today. So as I've explained to you and the audience know, Better Than We Found It was established to really not just understand the organizations that are delivering great change, but the people that are leading those. And I'm really keen to dive into your background and from your childhood, really, because I understand from our conversations that it's been quite a varied one. And I suppose that's formed part of maybe the reason why you are the leader that you are today. So could you tell us a bit about your earlier years in Sydney, and I suppose the prominence and influence of your father that you mentioned to me in your childhood?
Yeah, I grew up in Australia. I grew up in Sydney, and pretty classic suburban Sydney lifestyle. I had the great fortune of a very stable upbringing and went to a very good school, which gave me a lot of inspiration and exposures to different things. I took a bit of a liking in high school to history and politics and economics, and also, as you mentioned, my father was a geologist and traveled the world. So he would come back with incredible stories from Alaska and Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and various places. Photos in the jungle with, furry caterpillars on his nose and various other things. So I was very exposed at an early age to what was happening around the rest of the world. And I grew up at a time when we were transitioning from the Cold War into the post-Cold War era. I remember watching the Berlin Wall come down on the telly in high school and things. So all of those things had a pretty formative, left a formative impression on me, and a real hunger and desire to be part of understanding how the world works and getting out there and being part of it. So I guess I set my sights on an international career pretty early on, and was always interested in a number of different things. So that was sort of the genesis of my journey that started off a long time ago.
And you're fortunate enough to travel as well, quite significantly, to both established markets, but also these emerging and in some cases very isolated societies at a very young age. What did some of those experiences teach you about nature, but also, I suppose, life, communities, and the bigger pictures of society?
Yeah, well, I think one of the formative ones, which I shared with you in our chat before, Josh, was when I was about 12. I remember my dad said, before you become an adult airfare, which was a sort of a strange milestone in life, he said, let me take you up to Papua New Guinea on one of my trips, and you can sort of see what I do and where I'm working. And for me, it was an incredible trip. I was 12 years old. I flew up there by myself. He was already there. I met with him. I had the little accompanying pass on my luggage, and someone put me on the plane and took me off the plane. Within 24 hours, I found myself deep in the Papua New Guinean jungle, and in a village where literally people had never seen small white people before. They'd seen sort of big white people like my father with big beards and carrying a pick trying to find interesting rocks, but they'd never seen small white people. So it was quite an eye-opening experience for me. I'm sure it was for them too, but it really made me appreciate just the incredible disparity of the kind of lives that we were all living, right? That, I had this incredibly sort of modern and fortunate lifestyle in Australia, and there I was in essentially a very remote community living in a subsistence economy type manner, and it was really quite remarkable. Not that one's better than the other, but it was just such a contrast in such a short period of time. And of course, the jungles of Papua New Guinea are just a remarkable array of biodiversity. I saw birds of paradise and enormous trees and huge rivers. So it really did leave quite a striking impression on me, and I think was one of the sort of really early imprints for me about the importance of looking after the natural world. And so it's interesting that I've ended up working in that space all these years later.
Yeah, it's gone full circle. So you mentioned earlier that some of those areas at the beginning formed that view for you that foreign affairs would be the type of thing that was of interest to you. I suppose being quite young and having that mindset, though, is fairly uncommon, I suppose. For most of the people I talk to, they sort of fall into the career paths that they go down. But what was it that appealed to you about becoming a diplomat, or perhaps understanding maybe that you had some skills that could allow you to go down that route?
Yeah, well, I remember about the time I was 12 when I went on that trip, I remember wanting to be a music producer of MTV music videos. And then I got interested in architecture. And it was probably around 14 or 15 when I really got into history, modern history at high school, and also the study of economics, that my interest in sort of understanding how the world really worked and the flow of money, capital markets, the intersection with politics, and cultures and things, that's when it really all came together for me. So when I was about 15, I wrote a letter to the Foreign Ministry of Australia saying, well, what does it take to become a diplomat? And they very politely wrote back to me and sent me a letter in the mail. This is obviously all pre-email, just to date myself. But I received a wonderful letter in the post, basically saying, well, thank you for your interest, and these are the kind of careers and professions that we're interested in, and we take people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and you need to be curious, and you need to have a sense of the world and be interested in interacting with people and understanding who they are and what motivates them and things. And that all sounded quite appealing to me. So I sort of landed, I guess I found the thing that I really wanted to do around the age of about 15. And, I was interested in lots of other things as well, but I knew what my priority was. And so I set about continuing to focus economics and history and as key topics for study. I went to university and did international relations and economics at university. And then I was fortunate enough to get selected into the diplomatic fast track program in the Australian Foreign Ministry straight out of university, which was quite unusual. And so it was an interesting example, I guess, of sort of setting a goal and managing to pull it off. And so it felt pretty good when I got that letter of offer to join the diplomatic service at 21.
Sure. And what was that fast track program like? Was that an assessment process you had to go through, or an interview process? And what were they looking at that stage?
Yeah, I remember going to Sydney University doing a written test, and then there was a series of interviews. I think they had over 3,000 candidates for 37 jobs, what became 37 positions. So it was quite a competitive process, first to be eligible to join the Australian Public Service, and then specifically for that program in the Foreign Ministry. So it was a sort of two-stage approach. But lots of interesting people along the way. I remember being asked, given scenarios about, if I were in this embassy, how would I resolve a particular situation, or what do I think Australia's diplomatic position should be, or relations between, two countries at war and things. So, it was a very interesting way of being sort of screened and tested for your suitability for a role. And I guess I managed to say fairly diplomatic answers and navigate some fairly tricky issues. But it was a lot of fun, and I was just obviously delighted to make my way through to one of those final positions.
Sure. And so, how long did you stay there for? And what was then the pathway of those early years in the organisation?
Yeah, so I got my degree from Sydney Uni and packed up my bag and moved to Canberra, and began working at headquarters in Canberra for 2 years. And that part of that was part of the graduate program was a graduate degree, was actually part of the experience. So I did a part-time graduate master's degree while I was working, along with all my colleagues, and that was actually a prerequisite for being sent overseas on a diplomatic posting. So there was a very clear incentive to take the study seriously and finish all the coursework, in addition to the on-the-job training that we were receiving, 9 to 5 every day. So it was an intense but really fun 2 years. And then I put my hat in the ring for a posting overseas. I remember applying for Shanghai, Nairobi, and Vientiane in Laos. And I ended up pulling myself out of the hat for Shanghai because I didn't think I could do 2 years of full-time Chinese language training.
Okay.
And then I was fortunate enough to get the Nairobi position, which was my next choice. So I then spent 2 years in Kenya in East Africa, and then a year back in headquarters working on China's economic fortunes after the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s. And then, so I was there in total for 5 years before I then decided to move back to Sydney and go into investment banking.
Sure. And I know that when we talked, that you loved that job, and making that move away from it was really tough, but you wanted to do it to broaden your skill set and to gain that wider exposure. But it was quite brave, I suppose, of a move back then, because I'm sure there was a career pathway, if you had stayed, that could have been very rewarding and appealing as well. What was it that you remember that made you make that decision at that time?
Yeah, I was just very committed, and I guess this speaks to my instinct to be a generalist rather than a specialist. I was very keen to broaden my skill set, and I felt like the best thing I could do for my long-term professional development was to broaden my skill base. While I had had a long-term interest in diplomacy, I'd also, I guess because of my studying of economics and commerce, was quite interested in investment banking, which was growing at the time, and that had always piqued my curiosity, as had management consulting and the idea of sort of helping companies with their strategy and their global growth aspirations, as we were at that stage in the peak of excitement about globalization.
Yeah.
So for me, it was still very much an international angle, but perhaps from a business and finance perspective that I was interested in. So I just felt like the best thing I could do for my long-term skill development was to continue to push my long-term career was to continue to push my skills development. And so, yeah, it felt like jumping off a cliff, but it felt like, learning the world of finance, spending some time in corporate finance could only be a good thing, given the globalization of money and capital markets. And so I took the risk and thought, well, I'll leave a job that I love to go and learn something that seems important in a global context and push my skill development to the next level. But it certainly did feel like leaving something good for something unknown, which is probably not a choice that most people would make.
For sure. But I think as we'll come on to that, as you say, that generalist skill set and understanding lots of different areas of society will help in a leadership capacity towards the end that we will come back to. So where did you go? What was the role? Tell us a bit about what you moved into.
Yeah, so when I first started exploring opportunities to move into corporate finance and try my hand at investment banking, I fairly quickly came across this interesting opportunity to join the corporate finance team at Deutsche Bank in Australia, so global investment bank with a significant Australian operation. And they were very interested in my government experience because at the time, Australia was one of the leading markets in the world for public-private partnerships, what we today call blended finance. So bringing private finance in to help solve public policy problems. At that time, it was all about building infrastructure, so toll roads and airports and ports. But of course, there's a lot of complex public policy issues at the interface of getting business and government to work together. So the team at Deutsche Bank were really interested in the fact that I understood public policy, that I had a sense for how government and business should work together. And they also had aspirations of taking their Australian experience and exporting it into Asia. And so there was the foreign affairs element to the role and the aspiration they had. So I ended up joining a very specialized infrastructure project finance team at Deutsche Bank in Sydney, with the hope and the promise of contributing to building out a broader footprint for their business, not just in Australia, but also across Asia.
Sure, understood. And that was a couple of years, and then the move came around to go to do something again, slightly different.
Yeah, so what was interesting was, and the unexpected always happens, I was at Deutsche Bank for 2 years, and then September 11 happened, and global markets went into meltdown.
Yes.
Investment banks, like many others, decided to cut back and refocus their businesses. And so my job and most of the people in my team were all cut. And so I suddenly found myself looking for the next challenge. I wanted to stay in the infrastructure project finance space. And I ended up moving to a law firm in Australia that was very active in the project finance space. this time more in a sort of a back office business development role, supporting the lawyers because I wasn't a lawyer. So it was kind of an unusual move for a non-lawyer to work in the law firm. But I have to say, it actually proved to be a really interesting couple of years. And I very much enjoyed the challenge of helping to build a business as a business manager rather than being the technical expert in the front line providing the customer or client service. So for me, that was a great experience in learning how to build a professional services business. And there was a nice continuity of the focus in infrastructure, project finance, and also in Asia, because the practice that I was part of also ran a couple of offices across Southeast Asia for the firm. So it's interesting. You sort of, the unexpected happens. You sometimes get knocked off your horse, but it's interesting to find ways to keep some threads of interest and things going forward. So, yeah.
For sure. And I suppose the change in not only the change in the focus, but also the change in the environments that you've been in. Yeah, if we just take to that point, the 3 different organizations, 3 different, I suppose, ways of thinking, the commerciality of the final 2 organizations versus, the initial position. How did you find weaving yourself into these different cultures and almost starting from scratch in every one because you were new to the industry? It might have felt like you were kind of taking 3 steps forward and then 2 back each time, but you're progressing your career.
Yeah, I think what I learned from that experience is you sort of have to, as a generalist, you always have to back yourself to succeed in different contexts, and you have to have the ability to be agile and flexible. So, I sometimes reflect on my career and think I'm a bit of a chameleon. I sort of change colors and change spots to fit into the context. But I think that's part of being agile and being flexible and being able to adapt to different circumstances and contexts. So, if I fast forward to today, where I'm working in a very complex and multi-stakeholder environment, I actually feel very confident as a result of my varied experiences in dealing with most situations that come across my desk, because I've had to learn how to put myself into different contexts. And I think that actually came from the diplomatic experience, because of course diplomats are expected to drop into a different culture, a different country every couple of years.
Sure.
And you're expected to fit in very quickly and start, fulfilling your job and providing insights on the country that you're in or the people that you're meeting. So that ability to be agile and flexible and sort of dexterous is something that I enjoy. I like the challenge of being in different cultural contexts, whether it's different work cultures or different cultural contexts around the world. For me, that's a challenge. It's interesting and exciting, and I've learned how to do that fairly well and get going quite quickly, because you don't have a lot of time to find your feet in most corporate contexts, but also when you're a diplomat sent to different countries, you have to hit the ground running and be relevant and valuable within a couple of months. You can't take a year out of the 2 years you're there to find your feet, so to speak.
Sure. And talking about being, I suppose, able to deliver quickly, naturally then consultancy would come calling, because that's the exact environment for that type of individual. So you moved to
exactly.
At the time. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so after a couple of years back in Sydney, both at Deutsche Bank and then at this law firm, which is now Herbert Smith Freehills, one of the big global law firms, I wanted to go and do a graduate degree. I went to Harvard University and studied a Master's of Political Administration. I think for me, when September 11 happened, I mentioned I was in corporate finance. I had this profound realization while I was watching those terrible events in New York that I was in the wrong place, and I should have actually been back in foreign affairs and being prepared for this world that was about to change. So after those 4 years in infrastructure project finance, I decided to take myself to graduate school in the US, which had always been a dream of mine, and reposition my career again more in the economic development and emerging market space. And so I spent a year doing a master's degree at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then joined a consulting firm down the road from Harvard in Boston, that very much had a footprint and a very strong reputation and practice in emerging markets economic development strategy with leaders of governments. And that was super appealing to me, and it felt like a great intersectional way to combine my diplomatic, corporate finance, and business development skills that I'd been nurturing in Australia. And so I ended up then spending the next 10 years at Monitor, and then through acquisition at Deloitte, working in global economic development strategy consulting with government leaders in different parts of the world. And it was an incredible experience.
For sure. And how, I suppose, and we're sort of coming back now in that angle to some of these areas of broader sustainability and I suppose around the SDGs and their prominence in perhaps some of the work that you were doing. Could you talk about that journey in your time at Monitor, how I suppose the prominence of sustainability, or even it being referred to in that capacity, came to be, and how that stayed with you as you grew your career within the consulting firm?
Yeah, so while I was in a strategy consulting context, all of my work, both the vast majority of my work over that 10 years was always public policy facing. So I was typically working for leaders in governments, heads of state, heads of government, cabinet level ministers, who were trying to wrestle with this challenge of how do we drive growth? How do we do this sustainably? How do we create jobs for the people in our country? What are the trade-offs? What are the lessons learned from other jurisdictions that have done this well? And of course, delivering on all of the SDGs is a perennial challenge, right? There's always going to be trade-offs associated with pushing for growth versus natural resource constraints, financial constraints, etc. So I found that challenge of helping government leaders figure out a strategy within the context of constraints really interesting. It's very complex work. I had the great opportunity to do that spent a lot of time in the Middle East, but also in parts of Africa and elsewhere. So yeah, my work quickly became about helping government leaders formulate strategies for delivering sustainable growth. And I started initially on some of the hard economic SDGs, like infrastructuring things based on my previous background, job creation, industrial policy. And then I found over the second half of my 10 years in strategy consulting, I started to move more into the environmental SDGs, so water and agriculture and food systems and food security issues. So it was very interesting to sort of have the opportunity to traverse the SDGs over a 10-year period, providing advice to clients who are tasked with coming up with solutions to these complex development challenges.
For sure. And given your, I suppose, the pace of change that you'd had in the earlier stages of your career, staying with that firm for the period of time that you did, I was a bit of a change to that. What do you think it was that kept you there for so long and retained your interest that made it so successful?
Yeah, I think it's two things. One, the great virtue of management consulting, and there are lots of people who criticize management consultants and things, but when you're in it, the great benefit of it for the individual is you can have a huge variety of project assignments and jobs. So for someone like me who's restless for variety and likes to take on complex challenges, you can always do something for a while and then switch and do something slightly different or adjacent. And so for me, I think what kept me there for 10 years was just the variety and the stimulation of the project opportunities that came through. So being in a project-driven environment really, I think, worked well for my personality and my interests. The second thing was just great colleagueship. I found at Monitor was a place of great intellectual stimulation. People were genuinely interested in creating impact for clients and the intellectual agenda and robustness of what we were doing. Probably can't say that about all consulting companies. Having been a consultant, I think I can be self-reflective on the industry as a whole. But I did find the colleagueship of Monitor was fantastic, and certainly one of the things that kept me there for 10 years. So the internal culture, the curiosity, and the global mindset were things that really, really worked for me.
And then you mentioned earlier about it went through the acquisition with Deloitte, and fairly quickly afterwards, you decided that you would move on and set up your own business. What was perhaps the change in the environment that made you make that decision, and the things that perhaps you had seen before that you didn't feel that you were getting after that period of time?
Yeah. So I was at Monitor for 7 years and then Deloitte for 3 years. And I think the decision to move on and try and set up my own advisory practice and have a bit more flexibility in my life was really a combination of a few things. One, I had a major client for much of that period for 6 years in the Middle East, and that work just naturally came to an end. So it felt like, I'd sort of rounded out that amazing client journey with a client that I enjoyed working with for 6 years, and there was just a natural point of conclusion. Secondly, I also had small kids around that time, and the travel burden of constantly shuffling around the Middle East almost on a weekly basis was wearing me down. So with small kids, I wanted to have a bit more flexibility and a bit more control over my own time. So I think it was really those two things which prompted me to then set out on my own course and have a bit more flexibility as an independent consultant. So another transition.
Sure, yeah. So where in the world were you at that point? Where were you living?
So I was actually part of the Monitor Deloitte business in the Middle East. So I was attached to the business hubbed out of Dubai, but I was actually living in Jordan, in Amman in Jordan, where I had been doing a lot of work in the Kingdom of Jordan for 5 or 6 years. So I was in the Middle East, and as I said, had a couple of young kids born there, and life was changing quite quickly.
Sure, understand. So the consultancy firm, what was that set up to focus on? What was the goal or view when you went into that?
Well, it was actually very much to continue what I had been doing, which was to provide what I called sort of top of the house advisory services to senior leaders in government. So I had the very good fortune of a series of projects where I was advising heads of state and heads of government, so presidents, prime ministers, cabinet level ministers, which is actually a bit unusual in the consulting context. Normally you're sort of working to senior levels of the bureaucracy, not to the ministerial level. So I had built quite a unique practice within my 10 years at Monitor Deloitte. And I just saw an opportunity to continue to do that with a different coalition of partners and actors. And so that was really the instigation. So in many respects, it was to continue what I was doing, but just to go about doing it in a different way. And I had the opportunity at that stage to partner with a few individuals who had a very similar shared interest and a shared passion. One of whom I had been working with for several years, who also left Monitor Deloitte around the same time. And so it was really about finding a way to keep doing what we love to do and what we thought we were pretty good at doing on behalf of our client.
Sure. And then I know that the role before the TNFD was with the World Bank. So how did that opportunity come up? Was that through the consulting business, or was that a direct engagement? And what was that doing?
Yeah. So I was obviously looking to build out a portfolio of clients, which is the name of the game as an independent consultant. And I got approached, given my work in the Middle East, working with very senior leaders in government, I got approached to work on a World Bank project. So I had never worked with the bank before. I had always wanted to do that, so I was quite curious to see what that would be like. And so I took on this project. Again, it was in the Middle East, so it was in an area that I knew and where I was based. It was very similar work to what I had been doing, but in a different country. So a lot of it for me was the same. So it's always nice to keep a few things fixed and then vary one or two things. You don't want to vary everything at the same time. It becomes stressful and overwhelming. So there was a lot about it that was very familiar, but I had the opportunity then to work with a global development institution with some new colleagues. And so that was my entree into the bank. And then I ended up doing a number of projects with the bank, essentially through COVID and before and during COVID. And of course, much of that then went online as we all were. But yeah, it was a good opportunity to see how the bank provides integrated economic and social development advice to its country clients. So for me, it was a good extension of what I've been doing before, but again, from a different vantage point.
For sure. And then that leads us up, I suppose, to present day and the TNFDs. Yeah. The first thing that I want to highlight that I was pretty astounded by when you told me this was that actually the role with the TNFD came around through a LinkedIn application. So tell me more about this, because as a search firm, we pitch to our clients all the time that for the most senior and complex positions, an advert is not the way you're going to attract the right people. But I suppose when the opportunity is so good, like it was with the TNFD, that it would pique the interest of people who were perhaps not desperately looking to leave. But yeah, how did that come about, and what prompted you to apply?
Yeah, well, it was quite funny. I was quite happily working on these World Bank projects and a few other things for other clients of mine. At that stage, I had moved to Europe, so I was based out of Europe, where I now live. And like most professionals, I spend a chunk of my day having a quick flick through LinkedIn and checking out posts. And there was a post from a woman at WWF who I had started to follow only a few months before, because I liked what she had to say on LinkedIn, and clicked the follow button. And then she posted this job saying, this is a unique once in a lifetime leadership opportunity in the sustainable finance field. And I thought, well, I've had a few of these unique once in a lifetime complex type roles. I like these types of things. Let me have a look. And it was the job to be the CEO of the TNFD. So I went through the process of sending my application, and that was how I landed the job. So, I always find it, of course, there's lots of routes to the next career opportunity. So you were equally sort of surprised by my response. I was surprised by your response, because I thought lots of people got their jobs that way, but maybe not. But it was certainly fortuitous that I saw it, and it's been an incredible role over the last 2.5 years.
So back then, obviously the organisation had only always in its very formative stage. So how did the actual interview process? Who interviewed you? What was the governance like for the actual process?
Yeah, so TNFD was launched by four organisations working as a sort of consortium. The UNDP, UNEP FI, which is a sort of finance initiative of the Global Environment Programme, the WWF, the conservation organisation, and a group called Global Canopy. And so they had put together the scoping study phase for TNFD. They had appointed the co-chairs, and they ran the recruitment process for my role. So I just went through a pretty standard recruitment process. A couple of people checked me out. I made my way into a final round interview with the co-chairs. And we had a fantastic discussion. I remember being on holidays in Puerto Rico at the time, dialing in from there, and did a video interview with them. And the chemistry felt really great. I really liked their vision and drive to bring TNFD to life. At that stage, it was a sort of a business plan, if you like, and they needed someone to help them build a team and execute. And so that sounded like a pretty exciting challenge. So it was a fairly conventional process. It moved really quickly because, of course, there were then market expectations about getting started. And so they called me up a couple of days later, and I didn't hesitate to say yes.
And how familiar, interested, engaged were you in the TCFD and understanding what it was that you were actually walking into with the TNFD?
Yeah, so in the preceding 2 or 3 years, including during COVID, I had, like a lot of people, I was at home during COVID, bored. I had small kids. I was sort of trying to keep myself occupied during lockdown. I'm sure a lot of people can resonate with that. And I actually spent a lot of that time online, doing online courses and sort of teaching myself about where the sustainable finance movement was going. I had heard about TCFD, but I used that time to actually do some of the online certification education courses on TCFD so that I could really understand the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of this. So I guess I had the good fortune of having taken an interest in the area, done a few TCFD modules, and built some familiarity through that. And that was 2 years earlier. So when the job came around, I had a pretty good sense about what this was about, how this needed to play out, who the key stakeholders would be, and the idea of helping to orchestrate a task force of 40 senior leaders from across the private sector to develop a set of reporting recommendations on how to bring nature into the center of business and financial decision making seemed like a very important challenge and a great one personally to sort of help to orchestrate that. And having done a lot of that kind of complex project orchestration for senior clients before, like my work in the Middle East with presidents and prime ministers, I felt fairly confident that I had the right sort of skill set to play that kind of conductor of the orchestra type role. So that's the basis on which I thought I'd have a good shot at doing this.
For sure. And I suppose thinking back to those really early years in the jungle and your connection with nature back then, there was probably a burning purpose behind this and why it's so important, not just not just because it makes business sense, but also because there's a real reason why the organization and initiative exists.
Yeah, I had also taken an interest in the planetary boundary science, which had sort of emerged around that time. And I remember during COVID reading the book Donut Economics, which sort of pulls together economic thinking with the notion of planetary boundaries and the need to live within our planetary and environmental constraints. And so that had really sort of accelerated my interest in wanting to contribute in this area. So that was part of the stimulus for wanting to take on this role.
So Tony, since joining the TNFD in 21, the initiative has clearly been through a huge growth journey, substantive rise in prominence, and overall, I suppose, success. To date, what have been your proudest achievements of the initiative, and what do you see in the coming 12 months as the next steps on that journey?
Yeah, well, I think I've never worked in software before, but I imagine when you're developing a new app, there's always this scary moment whether the market's actually going to like the thing that you've just spent a lot of time building. So we did go about this process in quite a novel way, and perhaps because of the background of one of our co-chairs, David Craig, who comes from the technology field, we set out at the beginning by saying, let's develop this like software, and we'll take this kind of open innovation approach where we'll put out an early prototype, we'll encourage market feedback, and we'll keep iterating, adding the like button, so to speak, and seeing if people like the like button, and then we'll keep building. So we've taken that approach, and that, personally, it's been very interesting and exciting to run a kind of open innovation approach like that. It's a huge amount of work, but I think we've seen a huge amount of market input and activity into the evolution of our recommendations and our guidance. And in many respects, that was a lot of work up front, but it actually de-risked the moment when we released the recommendations in September last year at the New York Stock Exchange. But I have to say, one of the proudest moments was not just the release in New York at the Stock Exchange, and it was obviously great fun being on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And we did a takeover of the floor with the trading floor with nature images and stuff, which of course is a career highlight. But I think actually one of the proudest moments was a couple of weeks ago when at the World Economic Forum in Davos, we were able to announce that 320 organizations have already decided to start using the TNFD recommendations. So we had a sort of early adopter campaign, and we were frankly overwhelmed and delighted by the response. So 320 organizations, about $4 trillion of market cap amongst the publicly listed companies, and 14 trillion in assets under management from the investment owners and investment managers. So for me, that was a sort of proof of the pudding moment, right? Where people say, yep, this thing works and it's good and we're going to start using it. So I have to say, one of those highlights was just a few weeks ago. But I think the other highlight for me is this open innovation approach. It's not just what we've done, it's the way we've gone about doing it, because we've literally had tens of thousands of contributors around the world, from companies, financial institutions, civil society organizations, environmental NGOs, all contributing their time and their expertise to try and get us to the right place. And it's incredibly satisfying to know that we created a process that enabled so much input and contribution by others. So I'm really happy about the way we did it, as well as what we've managed to produce so far.
Sure, and I suppose in a world where there is a lot of skepticism around ESG and sustainability metrics that you're coming into or have come into, how does the TNFD ensure the credibility, the transparency, and also the reliability in the standards that it's setting and the disclosures that it's requesting?
Yeah, so I think the way to do that is by making it user focused and market driven, which is the approach that we've taken. And I mean, just to be clear, you just talked about standards. TNFD is providing recommendations which we hope will influence the development of regulation and voluntary standards as they continue to evolve. So that's actually our theory of change, and that's what we hope to see in the world. But we have no we have no regulatory powers or ability to ask or mandate people to do anything. So of course we've got to bring the market with us by making sure that what we produce is timely, is relevant, and is providing a set of comparable data and information that's decision useful for investors and other users of corporate reporting. So, I think the pathway to being relevant and having an impact is making sure that we're listening to what's needed, listening to the challenges of doing this, because a lot of companies, this is a new topic and it's hard. Climate was hard 10 years ago. Now everyone talks about scope 1, 2, and 3 like it's second language. And so we've got to get nature to the same place now. Nature has to become part of the way we think about our businesses and our capital allocation. So that's the challenge. But I think it really starts with sort of listening and making sure that this, at the end of the day, is something that's relevant to market participants. And that includes, obviously, policymakers and regulators who want to see companies taking the nature more seriously and starting to disclose information that shifts the flow of capital in the right direction.
And how do you see that specific journey unfolding with the move from being a voluntary initiative through to this mandatory disclosure? Because there is growing momentum that is where it should go and where it needs to. But I suppose there's challenges with that, and there's issues with a whole host of other competing mandatory standards that are coming. So how do you look at that from the perspective of business, but also finance, to create that journey where mandatory disclosures are there?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with changing the mindset amongst business and finance. So it's quite interesting when we walk into a room and do a conference or a virtual room as a webinar, there's always a segment of the audience that sees this as a compliance exercise. This is sort of about doing what you have to do and putting it into your reports. What we're trying to do is start by changing the mindset, because if we can change the mindset, we can change the behavior. And if we change the behavior, we can change the flow of financial capital. And the mindset shift that we need is that nature's not just a compliance issue. It's not a CSR issue anymore. We're talking about nature as a strategic risk management issue. And our central point, and we've got lots of case studies now to help make this point, is that it's in a business's own interest to take nature seriously as a risk factor, because if you don't, your future viability, your future cash flows are at risk, because it's the flow of benefits we get from nature which underpin our ability to generate cash flows in our businesses. So we're trying to play to the enlightened self-interest of business and financial leaders, and I think they're realizing now that, just as they had to get smart about cyber risk as a new type of risk for business, they're going to have to get used to get accustomed to think about nature as a risk issue. So that's our entry point into the conversation. We want to try and shift the way business think about nature, because at the moment, too many companies think it's about a cleanup day with their staff and the local community, or it's about giving some money to an environmental charity. All of those things are good and necessary, but that's not TNFD. TNFD is about recognizing that this is a strategic risk management issue for every company and every business and every provider of finance. So So if we can change that mindset, I think we can shift the behavior. And to the point around mandatory, central banks and regulators are already looking at nature as a risk to economies and societies. There's been a wealth of statements in the last 12 months on this issue from very prominent global central bankers and others. And so that is the momentum towards mandatory adoption. And, our goal is that TNFD can influence the evolution of those standards, both the voluntary standards by organizations like the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and then also through them eventually into regulation.
Sure, I understand. And I suppose the phrase of the day now seems to be about interoperability. And of course, it can be a challenge when you're looking at kind of standardizing frameworks. How does the TNFD address that issue when you consider the ISSB, the GRI, the ESRS, and what's your role in providing a cohesive approach so that these can work together for business rather than being a headache, I suppose, as they can sometimes be referred to by some people I talk to. I won't name any names.
The alphabet soup, yeah. Look, I think it's a real concern, and there's certainly a lot that's going on in the sustainability standards and regulatory space, so it can quickly become confusing. I think from our perspective, the first decision of the task force was, let's not reinvent the wheel if we don't need to. Let's build on what's already there. So we have explicitly taken what's there, looked at it, built on it, and tried to incorporate it. And so our focus has really been about trying to integrate the different piece parts like a puzzle, putting different intellectual property or frameworks and tool components together into an integrated approach, rather than trying to build something that's duplicative in any way. So we've very much aligned and built on top of the previous work of standard setters. And in fact, GRI, who you mentioned, have just issued a new biodiversity standard, and they've said that it draws on the TNFD recommendations, so that's good. The new European reporting landscape, CSRD, and their ESRS standards, they also acknowledge that TNFD has been a source that they have used to inform the development of those standards. So that's exactly what we want to see. And we're working very closely with the International Sustainability Standards Board, and like many who follow this space, we're waiting to see what their next set of priorities will be. They've indicated that nature standards might be next. And we've clearly indicated to them that if that's where they decide to go next, we'll be there to fully support their efforts. So interoperability is the name of the game. TNFD is a set of recommendations. It's not a competing standard. And so if we can work with the standards providers and influence their standards and help them to shape robust standards that are relevant to the market, then our job is done. And our goal actually in the next few years is to make ourselves redundant and close up the task force, just as TCFD did last year.
For sure. And Tony, could you elaborate on how the TNFD actively supports and also enables organizations who are embracing this concept of double materiality? And I suppose facilitating the business's comprehension of addressing not only their own impacts on nature, but I think to your point earlier, nature's impact on their operations.
Yeah, so we live in a world now where there's different notions of materiality that are actually in existence and in practice. So Europe has gone down the path and now regulated double materiality. Other jurisdictions are still mandating a, sometimes known as single materiality or financial materiality approach. So what's relevant to the company, not necessarily having to make disclosures about the impact on nature or the climate. So, we live in this world where there are different approaches. And so the approach of the task force was to say, it's not actually our job to mandate one or the other. We're not here to pick which one is better or worse. We had a lot of people trying to push us in that direction and say, well, you should be advocating for X over Y. But we took the view that we want TNFD to be relevant to as many market participants in as many jurisdictions as possible. So we set about building our guidance to be interoperable, that it can work in either a single materiality landscape or a double materiality landscape. So for those in Europe who now have to adopt double materiality as part of their CSRD reporting, the TNFD toolkit, and that's what it is, it's really a tool at the end of the day, can help people assess their materiality in both directions and prepare their disclosures to meet their reporting requirements under CSRD. So we think it's there to enable the reporting, but equally, if you're in a different jurisdiction where it's still single materiality, TNFD can equally help you understand the risks and opportunities to the business that might be material and be able to report on those as well.
A couple of practical questions now for people that might be listening that haven't taken a step down this nature-related journey. So what would you say would be the clear or absolute first step for an organization or a leader to, I suppose, understand and embed nature-related risks into their wider financial decision-making?
Yeah, so we get this question quite a lot. Where do we start on nature? Because it's a sort of completely new topic for us. And we're still trying to climb the mountain on understanding climate change and climate risk reporting. So I completely get it. And it's always hard to take on these new topics. And it feels like every month there's another one. So my advice would be to say, start by reading the Conceptual Foundations chapter in the TNFD recommendations released last September, because it really is a gateway entry into the concept of nature, how to understand what do we mean by nature, how is it relevant for business and finance, what are the key concepts, what are the key terms. As I said before, the market, now got used to talking about scopes and scope 1, 2, and 3. Nobody was using that language a few years ago, and we've all had to adjust and learn a new language system for climate change. And the same is going to be true now in relation to thinking about nature. So we introduced those concepts. The good news is, by taking a natural capital approach, the language is actually very familiar to those in business and finance. We talk about stocks and flows, about nature as capital. And so I think the language is actually quite accessible. The issue is it's just brand new, so people are looking at it for the first time. So I'd encourage them to have a look at the TNFD section on the conceptual foundations. And then the other thing I say to people is, if you're a CSO or a sustainability leader in the organization and you need to start thinking about these things, I think a really good, very simple thing to do is to get your team together over a cup of tea or coffee in the office and start with one basic question, which is, how do we think our business or our capital portfolio is dependent on nature? The new big word in the nature space is the word dependencies. Every company, every financial service provider through its value chain has dependencies on nature. And those dependencies are the pathway to risk to the organization. It might be financial risk, it might be reputational risk, it could be litigation risk, etc. So the first question is really to sit down and say, what are our dependencies on nature? And I think that's the sort of door opener into a process of inquiry that can get companies started in a very practical way.
Sure. And imagine that you were sat down with a skeptical business leader, and who you perhaps convinced might be the wrong word, but that you had to influence and engage with to allow them to see TNFD adoption as the right thing to do. What compelling case would you present to them to make them see that this is not just a compliance checkbox, but actually something they should genuinely be excited about?
Well, I'd probably start by telling them a few case studies of nature risk that's probably sitting in their balance sheet or in their cash flows today, and they just haven't been looking at it, right? So I mentioned before, TNFD is like a tool. I often call it a flashlight. We're giving people a flashlight to look in the dark cupboard in the corners that they haven't looked in before, and they'll probably find nature risk is there, right? There are dependencies in their business that they just haven't been thinking about before. So I would probably start with some case studies, and one of my favorites is the semiconductor industry. Every business in the world is now depends on digital technology for its critical processes and systems. We wouldn't be doing this podcast without chips everywhere in our computers and powering up the internet connection. So every business has dependencies on semiconductor chips. We've seen the semiconductor space explode in terms of market values for companies like NVIDIA and others this year off the back of gaming and everyone's very excited about AI. All of that's powered by chips. And the manufacturing of chips has a critical dependence on two things: electricity and a steady supply of fresh water into the production process of the chips. So we all have a second order dependence on the flow of water into the production process of semiconductor chips. And those chips are being manufactured in about 4 places in the world. So we have a dependence on the availability of water in Korea and in Taiwan and in Japan and in other places. So, we've seen what happens with major disruptions in global supply chains before. If those countries experience prolonged droughts and those droughts affect the ability of the semiconductor companies to produce the chips we all depend on, it will have major consequences across every sector in the global economy. So it might seem a bit remote, but if we can't get those chips to power up our businesses, every business will be feeling it in terms of their dependence on digital technologies and AI solutions and other things. We've also seen, countries like Sweden, major hit to their GDP growth a few years ago because their Land and Environment Court stopped the country's biggest cement manufacturer from continuing to dig out limestone because of its impact on the environment. It had ripple effects through the construction sector, through the housing sector. It caused a spike in inflation, and it slowed down economic growth. Something like 150,000 jobs in the Swedish economy were on the line because of the halting of its only cement manufacturing business. So you don't have to look far to find case studies of where risk has materialized or could materialize in a fairly short period of time. And so I think for the skeptical business leader, depending on the sector they're in, I would dip into my bag of case studies and give them some examples of how this might impact on their particular business or capital portfolio.
For sure. And if you were to, or your wishes for this year, if you were to see one thing within the ecosystem of society that we do more of, and one thing that we would do less of, what would they be?
Gosh, less of. I'd like to see us finding ways to substitute plastic in our consumer goods packaging systems. Every time I go and do my shopping, I think about how much plastic is in my shopping bag, and we all want to see our food and make sure that it looks good and there's no bruises and dents in it and it looks healthy, etc. But the entire packaging probably doesn't need to be plastic. Maybe we can have a small window that's plastic packaging so we can look in and have the comfort that we need to make our purchasing decisions. So I'd like to see an explosion of alternatives to plastic packaging in our consumer goods sectors. So I'd like to see a lot less plastic in my shopping bag every week. The thing I'd love to see more of is I think we're at the beginning of a transformation in scaling finance for nature-based investments and nature-based solutions. There's been a lot of talk about this over many years now, but if we actually look at it today, the big money is still sitting on the sidelines when we're talking about nature-based solutions. There's very few people have figured out investment models that can go to scale and start to pull in the big money, sort of $300, $400, $500 million ticket size that the pension funds and the big institutional investment owners need in order to deploy their capital. It just doesn't make sense for them to look at small projects. So I think there's a very exciting opportunity to bring the best minds from science, the nature science, together with the structured finance folks and figure out some of those investment models. So I'd like to see lots more people trying to innovate and figure out the solutions for scaling private sector capital into the challenge of tackling and reversing nature loss, because we know governments and civil society and philanthropy themselves don't have the financial resources we need to halt and reverse nature loss. We need about 700 billion a year. So private finance is essential.
Yes.
But we need to innovate on the investment models to bring the money in to start with.
For sure. And by the end of 24, what about from the TNFD's perspective? What's your one wish or hope of where the organization will be or what it will have delivered by that period of time?
Yeah, so we would like to obviously see lots more companies signing up voluntarily to start disposing on the nature-related issues. We're off to a good start in January with 350. It would be great if we finished the year at, say, 1,000. and we're pushing to encourage and support voluntary uptake of our recommendations. And as I said, that's in the best interest of companies to do that. So we're going to continue to make that case and hope that they see the logic and the benefit of doing that. The second thing is we are advancing proposals to develop a global nature data facility to make it easier for companies to find the access, the quality and comparability of data that they need to do the analysis and make the disclosures. So my hope is by the end of the year, we've got a blueprint for what a global data facility would look like. And we would then love to get lots of comments and feedback from market participants and regulators and others. So that's going to be one of our key challenges during the year, but I hope that's out for public consultation by the end of the year. And then I think the third thing is, hopefully by the end of the year, we're working on more nature standards from the key standards bodies like the ISSB and others, so that we can accelerate the journey towards a set of global baseline reporting standards that provide companies everywhere with a consistent approach to bringing nature into their corporate reporting. So that's a really important priority for us. We know it's complex, it can be complicated and overwhelming, so that interoperability and the consistency of approach is absolutely critical. So we'll keep driving towards that as much as we can.
Wonderful. And as we've spoken about before, the show being called Better Than We Found It, it's all about considering your own personal legacy. And you've already, in what you've done with the TNFD and throughout your career, have done so much. But looking forward, by the end of your career, and perhaps the TNFD, will play a key part of that. What would you like your legacy to be to show that you've left the world better than you found it?
Oh gosh, wasn't expecting that question, Josh. What would I like to leave behind? I think just having made a contribution and created some public value in the world. I think that's been the central organizing principle of my career, whether it was studying in diplomacy or working in economic development advisory support to national leaders. I've always been very focused on helping to address complex public policy problems and trying to make a positive contribution, whether it's on the environment or economic development more generally. So I guess if when I hand in my badge and my last job and headed to retirement, I hope I can say that I've made a contribution in different ways to creating some public value of some sort.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure and have no doubt that you will be successful in that journey. Now, there will be lots of people listening today who I'm sure are keen to explore more around the TNFD. You've already given a great signpost as to where they should start. But are there particular places that organizations or individuals can come to through the TNFD, or particular contacts that they should reach out to connect, engage, give feedback and talk about their viewpoints on the subject and get some support?
Yeah, well, look, there's tons of stuff on our website, www.tnfd.global, which is a good place to start. And there's a beautiful video on our landing page produced by the same company that does David Attenborough's films, which will give you a really great introduction into why this is so important. So that would be a great place to start. And we're also very active on LinkedIn. So if people are interested in following the conversation and the flow of things we're working on and participate in the conversation, do follow us on LinkedIn. And we also have something called the TNFD Forum, which is where companies that support our mission can sign up. We've got 1,500 organizations around the world now part of the TNFD Forum. So it's a great way to get our newsletter, but also to participate in developing the guidance. We do questionnaires and focus groups and various other things. So for people who are passionate about this topic and want to find a way to contribute, please follow on LinkedIn, and please do think about your organization joining the TNFD Forum, which will be an avenue for you to contribute to our ongoing work.
For sure. Well, we'll get the links for those and we'll make sure that they're in the show notes so people can click through and follow. So all that's left for me to say is thank you so much, not only for your time today and the fascinating conversation. I know that you doubted it, but we did definitely do at least 40 minutes on your own personal story. But thank you for that. But not only that, I think in the work you're doing on the, embedding nature related risks and disclosures into the financial and organizational community is paramount. It's needed, and it's trailblazing for what we need it to leave the world better than we found it. So on behalf of myself and GS2, to say thank you for the work that you and I know your incredible team are doing.
Thanks so much, Josh. Great to be with you for this podcast. Thanks.
Thank you. All the best. Cheers, Tony.